this and this substance came together. That does not allow in Islam for what we call kharq al-'ada, which is a break in the chain of events. For instance, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the fire, kuni bardan wa salama, be cool and peaceful, salaman. The ulama, Al-Raji says, not only did he say be cool, but he also said be safe. Because it's not simply enough to say be cool, because Allah could have taken the heat out of the fire, but still inflicted the same damage that fire will inflict on a human being. So this is a Muslim understanding that fire does not intrinsically burn. It burns by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a materialist will say, well no, if you put a match to your finger, you're going to burn your finger. Well, then they have people that walk on coals and do these type things, and this kind of makes people scratch their head. Right? But the point is, from the Muslim perspective, all of their sciences are conjecture. Now they are useful, but useful within their own limitations. And we should never forget when Newton, this giant to the Western civilization, intellectual giant, who gave them the foundations of their physics, this man's physics came into deep questioning at the turn of this century, because they recognized it was only limited to a certain model. It did not apply at the subatomic world. It worked very well in dealing with this physical world that we experience every day. But once they started actually looking into the atomic world and the subatomic world, they realized that this thing is very limited, this model. Now they think now that they've reached the height now, but 100 years from now, there may be scientists that look back now and say, look at what the darkness these people were in. So Muslims have always had this historical understanding that human knowledge is deeply limited. وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. This is a principle that the Quran gives us to know that knowledge first and foremost is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the one that teaches the human being. عَلَّمَ بِالْقَلَمِ. Allah taught the human being. So knowledge is literally a revelatory process. It is a process in which the human being is given insights based on the power of the intellect that Allah has endowed it with. Now when it's coupled with revelation, it allows for the human being to literally work within creation and not be a danger to himself or to creation, because he has certain parameters that he recognizes that he must stay within as an Adamic human being that is responsible for his actions. Now to give an example in the secular world, what happens? Recently in the South Pacific, there were a group of scientists who were oceanographers, people that study the ocean. Now they had this, they were having a problem understanding why is it that plankton and other types of seaweed do not simply take over the ocean. What is it in the ocean that is preventing this seaweed to proliferate in the same way that, for instance, grass will proliferate in an area given the right circumstances? Because the ocean has all these right circumstances for a limited amount of seaweed. What is stopping it from growing everywhere? So they came up with a hypothesis that it was iron, that there was the mineral iron was lacking. So what they did was they took an area, a 5-mile radius, and seeded it with iron pellets all over this area. They came back a month later. This was recently in the New York Times. They came back a month later and the entire area was covered with seaweed. It was completely covered with seaweed. They had destroyed the ecosystem of that area completely. One of the scientists who was being interviewed said that several of the people on the boat actually vomited, that they were so horrified. And this was their initial reaction, and then he said, and then we kind of became elated. So the initial reaction, the human gut-heart reaction, was they were horrified in that they're like children playing with extremely dangerous toys. You see, they're literally out there experimenting with a system that Allah has set up and balanced to perfection. And it's not for us to ask why there's not seaweed all over the place. It's for us to say, Subhanallah, that Allah has created this thing in perfect balance. Allah says in the Quran, in Surah Ar-Rahman, that He says, وَوَضْعَ الْمِيزَانِ أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ. He has placed this balance. in order that you might not transgress the balance. أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ وَأَقِيمَ الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ, and establish this balance with justice. وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانِ, and don't destroy this balance. Now this balance applies at every level of human existence. There's an ecological balance that we literally have the power to destroy based on the linguistic analysis of this injunction in the Quran. When Allah says, لَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانِ, He's telling us don't destroy it, which implies we have the ability to destroy it. And so this is what the human being without revelation becomes an extremely dangerous animal. Becomes a dangerous animal because the intellect, which has massive power, the intellect must be constrained by revelation. If the intellect is not constrained by revelation, then we see what we see, because this is what's happened in our modern world. We have an intellect that is completely gone crazy. And the word in Arabic, aqal, literally means to bind something, to constrain, that this is the point of the intellect. But it's an aqal that is imbued with wahi. What Al-Razi, Fakhruddin Al-Razi says, when Allah says nurun ala nur, He says wahyun ala aqal. That light upon light is revelation upon the intellect of the human being, because the intellect itself is an interface for revelation. It's a receptacle for revelation itself. Revelation cannot be carried by idiots. Allah in the Quran says, مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم. The likeness of those who carry this sacred revelation on their backs, right? Without, like donkeys. They're like donkeys. Because the donkey carries it but doesn't know what's on its back. The donkey has no idea it's carrying knowledge. And this is what happens when we take the Quran as a book to put on our shelves and we don't actually study it. We don't have it impact the intellect. The Quran, if the individual begins to recite the Quran, it will create a dynamic tension within the human being, because it demands thought. The Quran demands thought. One of the dominant modes, rhetorical modes in the Quran is what's called ellipsis. This is a mode that is not used in very many languages, and certainly not the English language. It's rarely used. But in Quran, the idea of harf is very important. And what this does is it demands the individual to think and reflect. Allah does not give all the information in the Quran, but He gives enough information that it can be worked out with thought. One of the most interesting things about the usul of our religion is that the vast majority of rules are based on what the usuliyin call dalail dhanniya, which are ambiguous proofs that demand ijtihad. In other words, Allah has given us a deen that is based on individual. The Prophet did not clarify this deen and spell everything out like A, B, C, D. Literally, you will find the Prophet actually gave commentary on very few verses in the Quran. If you look in Al-Bukhari, there's a bab al-tafsir. The Prophet gave commentary on very few verses. He clarified the Quran in his behavior. That is the greatest tafsir of Quran, literally, is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. But the idea of يَتَدَبَّرُونَ أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Don't they contemplate? Don't they ponder? If the Prophet literally told us everything the Quran meant, then why would we have to ponder the meanings of the Quran? If He spelt it all out for us, or the Sahaba, so they didn't do this. Why? Because every generation of Muslims has to take it upon themselves to literally study this book and learn to apply the book to their given contextual circumstances, which change with time and place. But the reality of Quran does not change with time and place. It can literally be applied in every time and place, which is the unique nature of the matrix of Quran, is that it will continue to engender interpretations of any human society. Now in the secular society, by taking revelation out, literally, and the Christians were completely done in, the science destroyed them. Science was not able to destroy Islam, and still they have not. The Quran, they've tried to find things in it. They gave up on Quran. They started focusing on the hadith, because the Quran, it was too difficult for them. The Orientals worked on the Quran and literally gave it up as a project to refute the Quran. You will find very few books that literally refute the Quran. In fact, the only books that they have written actually deal with the differences of the stories in the Old Testament and New Testament and the Quranic versions of them. They point these out, and usually it's simplistic fundamentalist Christians that do this. Real academics actually usually don't do this, because once you start poking holes in the Bible, pretty soon there's no end to the holes you can poke into it. You see, so what they begin to realize is the stories in the Quran actually make more sense than the ones in the Bible. And that's one of the points of the Quran, is it's muhaymin. It's actually an overseer and a guardian of previous revelation. They can see where they went astray and where they deviated by going back to the Quran. And they're forced to do this with the Arabic language. The Hebrews now in Tel Aviv and the places where they do semantical analysis of the Hebraic language,